Hello, this is Gina Piscatelli with a lecture for ANP2 on blood pressure regulation. So the first thing I want to mention is the importance of regulating our blood pressure. There's a lot of emphasis on not having blood pressure too high, preventing heart disease, that kind of thing. But we need to have some blood pressure to keep the blood moving so that it reaches our tissues, but not so high that blood vessels are damaged or that the heart has to work too hard. So there's two sets or categories of mechanisms that help to keep our blood pressure within a normal range. One set of mechanisms occur rapidly, but they only last for a short period of time. So that's for the minute-to-minute sort of control that we need within a day. Versus the other set of mechanisms, they occur slower, but they last longer. So they can last for days and weeks and things like that. So I'm going to first focus on short term and then long term, but let me just briefly mention here, to give you a big picture of where we're going, is that short term, we can change our heart rate, which if we speed it up or slow it down, is going to change blood flow, which ultimately changes blood pressure. In addition, since pressure is defined as the pressure of blood exerted on a vessel wall, if vessel diameter is changed for a short period of time, then blood pressure will be changed in accordance. So if the vessel diameter decreases, then the blood will exert more pressure. If the vessel diameter dilates or increases, then blood pressure won't be as high. So those are the short-term ways, by changing heart rate and the diameter of our blood vessels. Now, long-term changes in blood pressure can be attained by changing how much blood we have in our circulatory system. Now, this is going to involve the kidney, and it's going to be related to the quantity and quality of our urine output as well. But generally speaking, just changing how much blood you have will change how much pressure is exerted on our blood vessels. Now, we are also able to change the vessel diameter in our circulatory system long term, but that requires the use of hormones which stay in the blood for a period of days or weeks, not just a short neural mechanism. So before we get into the details of how blood pressure is changed with heart rate, how blood pressure is changed by the nervous system and the diameter of the blood vessel, or even the long-term processes, let's combine blood pressure with what we already know about blood and the circulatory system. So first is this concept of blood volume. We know that in our bodies we have somewhere between 4 to 6 liters of blood in the heart and in all the vessels. Now, if we have low blood volume, that decreases our blood pressure because there's just less blood pushing up against the wall of the vessels. If we have high blood volume, then that increases blood pressure. Now, something else we've also talked about is cardiac output. That's related to heart function. But as the heart pumps out blood, it's causing a pressure. It's causing a blood pressure. So if you look at what cardiac output really is, if we calculated it, it's related to how many times the heart beats and how much blood it pumps with each beat, so heart rate and stroke volume. Therefore, we know that if we increase the heart rate, we're increasing cardiac output, but guess what? That also increases blood pressure. And if we decrease our heart rate, Well, that definitely decreases cardiac output, but it also decreases blood pressure. And briefly, we'll mention stroke volume just because the sympathetic nervous system is going to be involved. If you increase the contractility of the heart and how much blood it can pump with one beat, all other things being equal, that will increase cardiac output and therefore increase blood pressure. That's the only instance we'll talk about stroke volume. Okay, so back to our list of things that change blood pressure on a short-term basis. First, we're going to look at how the heart rate is changed, okay? And then we're going to look at how the vessel diameter is changed. So heart rate is changed by the nervous system, specifically by the autonomic nervous system. And the sympathetic branch of the nervous system releases epinephrine and norepinephrine. And there are some neurons that go to the SA node, sympathetic neurons, and the AV node. That will raise the heart rate, and because the sympathetic nervous system also causes increased contraction force, will raise the stroke volume. So overall, the sympathetic nervous system increases the blood pressure. Another thing is that this sympathetic nervous system affects the adrenal gland, which releases more epinephrine. And if epinephrine gets into the bloodstream, it can cause vasoconstriction of all the vessels. And you probably recall that when we talked about blood vessels and the autonomic nervous system way back in AMP1, that there is always some sympathetic input into our blood vessels. There always is. We call that sympathetic tone or autonomic tone. And so if sympathetic input to the blood vessels goes up, and that means neurons sending more signals to the blood vessels, you'll get vasoconstriction, widespread vasoconstriction. So epinephrine can act by the nervous system being released by neurons as well as from the adrenal gland, and you'll get vasoconstriction in both cases. Then the parasympathetic nervous system releases acetylcholine, and that lowers blood pressure by lowering the heart rate. So that's the way that the autonomic nervous system can influence blood pressure. That lowers blood pressure, parasympathetic does, and sympathetic increases. And there are two interesting reflexes involved with this autonomic control of blood pressure. One is called the baroreceptor reflex. Baro refers to pressure. The other is called the chemoreceptor reflex, and that refers to chemicals in the blood specifically. There's a lot of detail on this slide, so I just want to deal with first the baroreceptor reflex. So in this case, there's a reflex based on the pressure in a vessel. So there's a rise or a fall in blood pressure. That's the stimulus, which is detected by certain cells called baroreceptors in the aortic arch and in vessels, the carotid vessels, and these cells are called carotid bodies. So they sense this rise or fall, and they send a signal via a neuron to the brain. And the part of the brain is the medulla oblongata. And that medulla oblongata integrates all the information it's getting from all over the body and sends out an appropriate response, either through sympathetic neurons or parasympathetic neurons, depending on what is needed. And the sympathetic nervous system innervates vessels and the heart. The parasympathetic primarily the heart, but nonetheless, vessels and the heart are the ones that are the effectors of the baroreceptor reflex. So I'd like to show you where these receptors are located. The baroreceptors and the chemoreceptors are in the aortic arch and in the carotid arteries, where they're called carotid bodies. And there are neurons attached that travel to the medulla oblongata, so that the medulla oblongata can determine what the appropriate output should be to the heart rate as well as to the vessel diameters. Okay, so we're going to look at the baroreceptor reflex, an example of how it works, and then we'll go back to chemoreceptors. So I put this little start here sign so you know where to begin. And I'd like you to look in the very middle of the slide where it has blood pressure hemostasis. So assuming this seesaw is level and blood pressure is right where it needs to be, that's homeostasis. And then when we experience a rise in our blood pressure, homeostasis is imbalanced now. And the high blood pressure is detected by baroreceptors that send a signal to the medulla oblongata. Now the medulla oblongata has to decide what to do once it's been told about this high blood pressure. And what it will do is lower the sympathetic output, but raise the parasympathetic output. By lowering sympathetic output, you decrease the rate that the heart beats. You decrease the force of each heartbeat. And since there's less sympathetic input to the blood vessels, those blood vessels won't constrict, they'll dilate. In addition, with the high sympathetic output, which goes to the SA node and the AV node, that slows the heart rate even further. Overall, you're going to get a decrease in blood pressure. So that's in response to high blood pressure. We have a system in our bodies that responds to try to lower blood pressure through decreasing our heart rate and dilating our blood vessels. Now, if we take the opposite situation, so number 2, start here on the bottom. If we experience a drop in blood pressure, that is also detected by baroreceptors, and a signal is sent to the medulla oblongata. Now, the low blood pressure means that the medulla needs to increase the sympathetic output. And what it will do is increase the heart rate, increase the contractility, and increase vasoconstriction, all resulting in a higher blood pressure. Okay, let's go back to the chemoreceptor reflex now. In this instance, it's not that much different, but instead of detecting blood pressure, there are sensors that are detecting how much carbon dioxide, oxygen, or acid is in the blood. And so these are chemicals. And so the cells, the chemoreceptors, also present in the aortic arch and carotid bodies, can detect a rise or fall. Again, they will send a signal to the medulla, and the medulla oblongata will make sure that it sends out either parasympathetic or sympathetic appropriately, again to the heart and blood vessels. But in addition, because we've got these gases involved, there will be a signal sent to the respiratory system. Okay, so let's look at how the chemoreceptor reflex works. I have mentioned that the chemoreceptor bodies and the aortic arch, or aortic body, sometimes we call it, that's to detect CO2, O2, and pH, or acid, in the blood. But there are also chemoreceptors in the brainstem that instead are detecting the same chemicals in the cerebral spinal fluid. So the detection and sending the information to the medulla will be the same, as well as the actions. The actions will be the same. So we're going to just summarize all chemoreceptor reflex, CSF or blood, as the same. Okay, so let's say we first have a homeostatic imbalance. And in this case, I've chosen high CO2, low oxygen in the blood. And anytime you have high CO2, the blood becomes acidic. So the pH goes down. The chemoreceptors are stimulated and they send a signal to the brain, the medulla oblongata. Now, what does the medulla oblongata do? Well, it's going to send a signal to the heart and send a signal to the vessels, but also to the respiratory system. So, the signal that the medulla oblongata sends to the heart is sympathetic, increasing the heart rate and contractility, which increases blood pressure. And the whole idea is that if the blood has less O2, we better keep pumping blood to tissues just to get as much oxygen to them as possible so that tissue death doesn't happen. But the medulla oblongata will also send signals via sympathetic neurons to blood vessels to vasoconstrict, and that will also increase blood pressure. So that same idea, just with the elastic recoil of arteries in particular, let's get the blood out to the tissues and get as much flow there as we can to pick up waste and drop off oxygen. But the last thing is that it's not going to do much good just pumping the blood and what it contains. We need to also change the chemicals, the concentration. So the medulla oblongata will also send a signal to the respiratory system to increase the rate of respiration. And that, of course, will mean that O2 in the blood will rise. Carbon dioxide will go down because it will be exhaled more rapidly. And anytime CO2 goes down, the blood becomes more basic, and so the pH will rise as well. And so now homeostasis has been restored and the chemoreceptors won't be stimulated any longer. Okay, now another short-term way that blood pressure can be regulated, and truthfully, it's just a local regulation of blood pressure. It won't be a systemic-wide change in blood pressure, just at certain vessels, is referred to as intrinsic control or autoregulation. Now, the advantage to changing blood pressure at a very local site within the circulatory system is that it's going to control blood flow to specific tissues. And that means that some tissues are going to need more blood flow and others less at certain times. So this is all to meet the local needs. Okay. So vessels supplying a tissue can regulate their own blood pressure by constricting or dilating. And when they constrict, if they constrict enough for sure, we're usually talking pretty small vessels, they decrease blood flow. But if the blood vessel dilates, that increases blood flow. Now, all of the constriction and dilation of blood vessels has to do with the contraction of smooth muscle. So we're going to see that one of these autoregulatory mechanisms is called the myogenic response. Okay, so what happens when smooth muscle or the wall of the vessel is stretched? Well, what we're going to see happens is that smooth muscle will contract in response. But then also vessels auto-regulate their own blood pressure through vasoconstriction and dilation based on what the tissue needs. So you have a blood vessel surrounded by tissue. And so in some ways we're talking about the pressure against the wall of the vessel. That will involve the myogenic response. And in other ways we're talking about the needs or concentration of chemicals in the tissue. So the needs of the tissues. So like oxygen, that's supposed to be oxygen, or CO2, right? So that's more of a metabolic control, but it still will affect the smooth muscle in the vessels. So let's do the myogenic response first because I think it's a lot more straightforward. And that is smooth muscle contracts in response to stretch. And the purpose of this is that if our systemic body-wide blood pressure varies, it goes way up or it goes way down, a vessel has a way to control the pressure that it sees on its own. This is particularly important in the kidney where the vessels are delivering blood to a filtration system. And we need to make sure that these blood vessels don't break, burst, and that flow happens in a controlled manner to get the wastes out of the blood. That's an important place, but it's important in other places too. So, if systemic-wide blood pressure is high, the vessel will stretch, and the smooth muscle of the vessel will constrict in response. So if it constricts in response, although it increases blood pressure locally, what's happening is it lowers the blood flow and prevents damage to the vessels. If instead we have a systemic-wide drop in blood pressure, like when somebody goes into shock, right? We still need wastes to be taken out of our blood, right? So vasodilation will happen. There's no stretch, right? But the vasodilation will keep the local blood flow going. So that's important. Okay, so this is just a summary slide that has to do with the myogenic response again, but I wanted to mention that it's not just the smooth muscle in the wall of the vessel that can control blood pressure through a capillary bed. There are muscles at the beginning of a capillary bed called precapillary sphincters. They're made up of smooth muscle. And they control how much blood gets into this capillary bed. Right? Now, always there's going to be some blood flow in the capillary bed through this middle vessel. But that if these sphincters contract, most of the blood will flow past the capillary bed and go to a different location that needs it more. So, in terms of blood pressure, if a person has high blood pressure, as is shown here, and a stretch is detected, a vessel does in fact constrict, which increases blood pressure, but it decreases blood flow. And in addition, these precapillary sphincters will contract, and therefore flow will be restricted, and these capillaries will not be damaged. In the opposite end of things, if we experience low blood pressure, systemic-wide low blood pressure, then there's no stretch detected, and these precapillary sphincters relax. And so blood will flow through the capillary bed just fine. Okay, now let's talk about the metabolic controls that are related to how a blood vessel can control its own local blood pressure. This has to do with the tissues sending signals to the blood vessel. So when there is low perfusion of a tissue, what you get is a buildup of wastes in the tissue and low oxygen levels, right? So in response, what will happen is the blood vessel will dilate. And the concept is that you're increasing how much blood can get to the tissue. And one chemical that causes this dilation is nitric oxide. It's actually released by the endothelium of the blood vessel. But there's also histamine and prostaglandins coming to the vessel to telling it to dilate. In addition, there are endothelins that are present, or that can be made anyway, by the endothelium of the blood vessel. And those endothelins would cause vasoconstriction instead. I'd like to give you an example, something that is a little bit more tangible, so you can understand how the metabolic conditions of a local tissue can affect the blood vessels that are supplying it locally. So the picture on the left is diagram A. And in that situation, what we have is normal diameter or normal vasomotor tone of these cerebral arterioles. And in this instance, the brain tissue has normal levels of oxygen and carbon dioxide. In the second diagram, we'll call this B, notice that there's some dilation of the cerebral arterioles. So that'll increase blood flow to the brain tissue. And that was triggered by the fact that the brain tissue is experiencing high carbon dioxide and low oxygen. Now, in the third case, we'll label it C here, we see that the vessels are constricted. And this is because there's very high oxygen and very low CO2 in the brain tissue. I thought that might make it a little bit more tangible for you. Okay, that's all we need for short-term rapid changes to blood pressure. Now we're going to look at long-term control of blood pressure, and these mechanisms are going to happen more slowly. But in some ways they're a lot more straightforward because they involve changing blood volume more than they involve any metabolic conditions. So there's two ways that our bodies can change blood pressure in the long term. One is by changing our blood volume, and another is through hormones that either change blood volume or change the diameter of the vessel. So I'm going to first deal with the kidney, because in both of these instances the kidneys are going to be the effectors that change our blood volume. Okay, and so when I'm going to talk about kidneys first. So let's look at the relationship between kidney function and blood volume. So we have a certain blood volume, 4 to 6 liters, in our circulatory system. And what the kidney does is filter the blood. So blood comes into both kidneys, and wastes are taken out of the blood. Some good things too that we want to stay in the blood. But all the wastes and anything we can spare that we don't need to reabsorb back into the blood will enter the urine. So an important part of kidney function actually has to do with reabsorbing what got filtered out of the blood that needs to be reabsorbed back into the bloodstream. That's an important function of the kidney. So overall, if we have experienced low blood volume, we're dehydrated or whatever, kidney still needs to function, and it filters that blood, filtering the plasma, and any plasma or any water that is filtered out of the blood can be reabsorbed back into the bloodstream, which will then raise our blood volume, and that higher blood volume will increase our blood pressure. So that's a mechanism for controlling blood pressure. Yes, I started with low blood volume, but think about the fact that if you start with high blood pressure, you could decrease the blood volume, and that would decrease your blood pressure. So one caveat to this is if you reabsorb more water back into the bloodstream, you do produce more concentrated urine, and less of it. So now let's look at kidney function in terms of starting with a high blood volume, which is pretty rare, but we'll just say that happens. The kidney filters the water out of the plasma, and instead of reabsorbing that water back into the bloodstream, that water is going to enter the urine. And so you'll have an increased urine output. The urine will be more dilute. So that means you'll have a low blood volume, but that will lower your blood pressure. So that's what the kidney does primarily. And I'd like to show you the site where, in the kidney, where water is reabsorbed. It's reabsorbed. This is a picture of the blood coming into the kidney, and the wastes are filtered in that little round ball. It says wastes are filtered from the blood here. It's called a capsule, Bowman's capsule. And all the wastes and anything that we really need to keep too travel in this tubule called an nephron, but you'll learn that later. If anything needs to be reabsorbed, there are certain sites where things are reabsorbed from that tubule, and it goes back into the blood. Notice here I've got water being reabsorbed into the circulatory system, and there's a couple of sites where that happens. So that's how the kidney functions to reabsorb water, or where it does. Now, it turns out that the kidney has two mechanisms for regulating blood pressure. One we call direct, one we call indirect. So the direct one has to do pretty much with what we've already talked about, but I need to discuss it not so much in terms of urine production, but in terms of changing blood pressure. So this is an explanation for how the kidney directly regulates blood pressure. If blood pressure is too high, that means the blood is flowing pretty fiercely and quickly, and so the filtrate is going to be created very quickly and move through the tubule very fast. It'll move so fast that there will be less time for reabsorbing water back into the blood or any other thing that we need to reabsorb back into the blood. So you do increase urine output, but this will lower blood volume and ultimately leads to a decrease in blood pressure. So in a way, it's not exactly autoregulation, but it is a direct regulation. Blood pressure was high, and in response, blood pressure decreases. And it all has to do with the kidney lowering the blood volume. And the opposite is true as well. If blood pressure is low, then blood is pumping more slowly. I wouldn't say terribly slowly, but the fluid is going to move through this tubule slower, and that will give more time for water reabsorption. And if water is reabsorbed more, then that raises the blood volume and therefore increases blood pressure. That's a pretty nifty system. Now, the kidney is said to also indirectly regulate blood pressure. And that's because it makes this hormone called renin in response to low blood pressure. So indirect in the sense that, yes, it responds to low blood pressure, but it makes a hormone that's going to result in many other effectors. A wide range of effectors are all going to act to raise blood pressure. So we're going to look at how that works. First, dealing with just the production of renin and the first step of what that renin does. So a drop in blood pressure is detected by these special cells in the kidney. I'm sorry I even wrote those down. You don't have to know for sure yet. Later. So low blood pressure is detected by the kidney. And in response, those cells make a hormone called renin. And since it's a hormone, that renin enters the circulatory system. Okay, now what's the first thing that renin does? Well, there's something in the blood called angiotensinogen, and renin turns it into angiotensin 1. So now we have angiotensin 1 floating around in the circulatory system. No changes in blood pressure whatsoever. All we've done is made this thing called angiotensin 1. Well, eventually blood containing angiotensin 1 reaches the pulmonary capillaries, where there is an enzyme lining the vessel walls that convert angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2. And this is going to be our activator, I guess I'll call him. Not exactly the effector. So the real purpose in producing renin by the kidney is to make this angiotensin 2, which is also a hormone, and now it's floating around in the bloodstream, and it will stimulate various effectors now, all of which will increase blood pressure. So we're still saying this is an indirect method that the kidney can change blood pressure, because angiotensin 2 would never have been made if the kidney didn't release that renin. But now we have angiotensin 2 in the bloodstream, and when angiotensin 2 reaches the hypothalamus, because the blood flow goes to the hypothalamus, that stimulates thirst centers in the hypothalamus, and so usually we drink more, and if we drink more, our blood volume goes up, and that increases our blood pressure. So that's one thing. The second thing is angiotensin 2, being a hormone, is floating in the blood vessels in the bloodstream, and that stimulates widespread vasoconstriction. The blood vessel wall contracts. So that's going to raise blood pressure. And then the last thing that angiotensin doesn't do, it does, is it stimulates this adrenal gland sitting on top of the kidney to release another hormone. That doesn't sound like a very big deal, but this hormone also raises blood pressure. Now finally we're going to see involvement of the kidney. Aldosterone is the name of the hormone, and it stimulates the kidney to retain water and sodium, and that raises blood pressure. So I want to now look at what does aldosterone do, because that's a part of this whole indirect means of the kidney altering blood pressure. This will always be one of the steps involved in that. So once the kidney has detected low blood pressure, released renin, renin has somehow made angiotensin 2, and angiotensin 2 has stimulated the adrenal cortex to make aldosterone. What happens? Aldosterone stimulates the kidney to reabsorb sodium. And there are specific locations where this happens. I've got an arrow right there that shows us that sodium is reabsorbed from this location of the tubule. Now, water always follows sodium. If it goes into the tubule, water follows. If sodium goes out of the tubule, the water follows. So what will ultimately happen is that both sodium and water will be reabsorbed, and the sodium and the water will enter the blood. That will increase blood volume and raise blood pressure. So that's the indirect mechanism. Now we just have a few other hormones that control blood pressure or change vessel diameter, but mainly by doing blood volume. So let's look at the two that we haven't done yet. One is antidiuretic hormone, or ADH, and that is made by the posterior pituitary gland. Another is atrial natriuretic peptide, also known as ANP, made by cells in the heart, the atria of the heart. That's how it gets its name, atrial. These have opposing actions. So let's look at all the hormones that we're going to talk about in relation to blood pressure before I get into those two. I've kind of categorized all the hormones that we're going to look at. There's 5 of them. They all start with the letter A. Lovely. I've categorized them based on which ones increase blood pressure and which ones decrease blood pressure. So we've talked about angiotensin 2, that increases blood pressure. So does aldosterone. So does epinephrine, and it's considered a hormone when it's made by the adrenal medulla. All of these increase blood pressure, but by different means. Angiotensin 2 can cause vasoconstriction as well as an increase in blood volume through the thirst mechanism and the activation of aldosterone. Aldosterone increases blood volume, and epinephrine is involved with just vasoconstriction. But all of those increase blood pressure. The other two we haven't talked about, and there's only one that decreases blood pressure, and it's this atrial natriuretic peptide. Both of them, though, you'll notice are going to affect blood volume. So let's start with antidiuretic hormone, or ADH. I'm losing my voice. Sorry. And its name refers to urinating less. Uresis means to urinate, and so antidiuresis means, or diuretic means to urinate less. And so what that means is you'll have a lower urine output. And if you have a lower urine output, what happens is the kidney reabsorbs more water to prevent the production, so much urine being produced. So the blood is going to get filtered in the kidney. There's water in there, but the water is going to get reabsorbed. and you'll get lower urine output coming out of the very end of this tubule. But your blood volume has increased and your blood pressure has been raised. So that's what antidiuretic hormone does in response to low blood pressure. Now let's look at atrial natriuretic peptide. It's made by the cells in the atria, and what its name refers to is urinating sodium. Natrium, I think, is Latin for sodium, and of course uretic means urinate. So urinate sodium. So ANP, or atrial natriuretic peptide, causes sodium to remain in the kidney tubule and be eliminated with the urine. So remember what I said, wherever sodium goes, water follows. And so water is going to stay inside that tubule too, and you produce a whole bunch of urine. It'll have sodium in it too, but you'll produce more urine. That will reduce blood volume because the water won't be reabsorbed back into the bloodstream. And if you reduce blood volume, you lower blood pressure. Okay? The other thing that atrial natriuretic peptide can do is it does cause widespread vasodilation. And I suspect that has sort of evolved because we don't want the heart to be under too much stress. And the more dilated the coronary vessels are, the better for the heart muscle. And so here you have a local heart hormone that's acting on those local blood vessels to cause vasodilation. So that is the end of blood pressure regulation. I think it is the most complicated topic that we discuss maybe all semester. And I would like you to know that if you look at the document that's posted on Blackboard that has these slides, there's some slides at the end that help you answer the study questions that go with blood pressure regulation. Thank you.